August 1964. The first American plane is shot down over North Vietnam. The pilot is captured. More than 600 American airmen become prisoners in the North. Their prison treatment and political statements are a lasting controversy. In 1967, the U.S. intensifies Operation Rolling Thunder, the attempt to bomb North Vietnam to the peace table. In this year, American fighter bombers fly 100,000 operational missions over North Vietnam. The U.S. loses 326 planes. 179 pilots are captured. 2 of these tell their personal history.
On the day of my capture, I was shot down by the 37 and 57 millimeter anti-aircraft weapons. The aircraft was, as I recall, hit 3 times. There was a sort of a boom, 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 and immediately the cockpit filled with smoke. When I ejected, because of the force of the air and the speed that I was going, I was momentarily knocked unconscious.
Captain John Dramacy, a US Airforce pilot shot down April 1967 near the partition line. Only half the pilots survived the crashes. This is communist film of a typical capture. Usually the pilots are taken prisoner by the local militia. Travel to prison camps is slow. This is the best time to attempt escape. Colonel Edison Miller, a Navy pilot, shot down at the partition line October 67. Miller tries twice to escape.
They found me untied, they retied me, they left. I got myself untied again, and they came in, and the guard that found me took a stick and beat me and on the side, mostly on the left side, and as a result, my left arm from the wrist on down was paralyzed. I had no control over my hand or fingers for months, and it was about a year before I regained full strength and use of my hand back.
The first time that I escaped was at an intermediate camp prior to arriving in Hanoi. The cell was essentially made of wood, and there was one section of bars there. One day I was able to dismantle the wall sufficiently so that I could squeeze through a portion of it. There were 2 guards outside of the cell. I was able to slip past them, and at the time that I got into the fields again, I managed to darken my skin with mud. I took my shoes and I put them on my back so I looked like an old humpbacked man. And I actually passed by a number of North Vietnamese peasants in the fields. It proved very effective, except that finally I came very close to an old man in the field, and he chastised me for trespassing upon his portion of the field. And when he came close to me, he realized that I was not one of his own kind and went scurrying off to get help. Finally, I was, as I say, I was in the middle of an open area, and then the soldiers came and they captured me the next day after I had escaped that night.
Dramacy and Miller are taken to Hanoi, where there are 5 prisoner of war camps. Some prisoners spend up to 8 years in the different camps. The main processing camp in Hanoi is an old French prison. It is the one seen throughout these North Vietnamese films. The pilots call it the Hanoi Hilton. It is here that prisoners have their first interrogation. Two of the prisoners, Dramacey and Miller, give different interpretations of their treatment and actions. Captain Dramacey.
The Hanoi Hilton was specifically built as a prison. It was a rather formidable place. One would enter through large gates and through a hallway, and when you went in, on the left-hand side, there was a small room. I think one of the initial names for it was the Green Room. And this is where many people had their first interrogations. It was an attitude that they were looking for. They wanted to call the people out that were that presented what they referred to as the proper attitude. If an individual went there attempting to establish what I refer to as the proper relationship being one of, I'm an American fighting man and I have certain obligations. If they recognize that, I think that they would put a person through these tortures to break the spirit. In my situation, I was put into the stocks, and then my left hand was shackled to the right, to my the stock or the iron bar that went over my right foot. So I was sort of doubled over. When they yanked my foot out of the stocks, I actually left some flesh on the bar itself.
We get into an argument over torture. I really still believe that. To me, torture is a very extreme form of abuse, such as pulling out fingernails, cutting off parts of the body, that type of activity. And while I was beaten a few times, hit, pushed around, kicked, tied up tightly, strung from the rafters on one occasion for a short period of time, I don't think that was torture. The POWs themselves came up with a definition that torture was only extreme physical abuse when they were attempting to get military information from you. And I think that defines it pretty well, because I don't think much of that went on. Certainly if the Vietnamese were angry with you, if you were choosing to be obnoxious in the prison system, a guard was very likely to wrap you rather severely, even tie you up rather tightly and leave you lay on the floor. I spent 40 days in leg irons and handcuffs. Of course, this followed an attempt to escape. I didn't look at that as a form of torture.
A U.S. military report says that 60% of the prisoners are tortured. Camp conditions reflect the hardship in Hanoi. Meals usually consist of cabbage soup, some rice, and pork fat. Food is sometimes withheld as a disciplinary measure. Hanoi at first described the captured Americans as war criminals. Early camp conditions are strict, with little exercise or communication permitted. But the prisoners find ways.
And then there was another method of communicating, and this was by coughing and making sounds. Certain sounds meant certain things. For example, a cough or a guttural sound. All these things had certain meanings. So there were the messages. There was the tapping. There was the coughing and the guttural sounds that we used. And there was the flashing of the letters of the alphabet by using the hands.
Hanoi now accuses the U.S. government of breaking the POW rules. It says food parcels sent to the prisoners contain tiny radio parts hidden inside items such as toothpaste. A tin of peanuts is said to contain microfilm intended for the prisoners. The microfilm details a rescue attempt by U.S. commandos at a POW camp called Son Tay outside Hanoi. But the camp is found empty. U.S. authorities deny any knowledge of the hidden devices. After 2 years of imprisonment, Miller makes his first anti-war statement. Dramacey sees such statements as aiding the enemy.
The primary purpose of the prisoner in North Vietnam was to prevent from being used politically. And I think this is the thing that some did not realize. They did not realize the tremendous effect of the psychological weapon of warfare.
I participated in war. I made up my mind the war was wrong, particularly the way we were conducting it, and I thought that as a leader, I had an obligation to speak out, and was hoping that people would understand that it was my sincere beliefs, and therefore act on it.
350 American pilots are captive in North Vietnam when bombing is temporarily halted in 1968. Some pilots have been prisoners for almost 4 years, and will be for another 4.
We go back to the fact that the bombing ended in early '68. You're looking at 4 years when we're sitting in prisons up there and have no knowledge, actual, factual knowledge that the war is continuing, except we're still sitting there in the cell. So I think there was a lot of discouragement about the prisoners as to what was going on, how long were they going to sit there.
How can you live in a place and not knowing when you were going to be getting out and be satisfied with your condition? Some had been there 7 years, longer than any prisoner in the history of America. So it was not expected that we would get out almost immediately, or the next year, or the next year. One did not know.
Spring 1972. North Vietnam invades the South. With American ground forces almost gone, the U.S. deploys massive air power to repel the communist offensive, and at the same time, it resumes bombing the North. 72 pilots are captured. The new prisoners bring to the camps a different perception of America's role in the war.
Those that came over to Vietnam and were shot down and captured in '71, '72, I think they had a feel that a large segment of the American people were opposed to this war. I don't believe those shot down in '65, '66, '67 had that feeling that the American people were that strongly in their feelings against the war. And I think that was difficult for a prisoner to believe. When we would hear on the Vietnamese radio that there were these big anti-war statements, a lot of people poo-pooed them, just saying that they couldn't believe the American people would be doing that.
The release of the prisoners is now a major aspect of peace negotiations. Those captured in the last years find better treatment. Prisoners are allowed to organize camp activities. Some prisoners feel others are being politically used.
One resists to prevent from being used to make, again, I mentioned those propaganda tapes, used to prevent yourself from giving information, to prevent yourself from demoralizing everyone else. These are the kinds of things that you do to resist, the reasons why you resist.
I didn't actively speak out in any way until May of '70. By that time, I'd been in a prisoner of war over 2.5 years. And at that time was the famous Mother's Day message that's being quoted all the time these days.
In a tape-recorded message, Miller says, America's mothers must face the fact that their sons are killing fellow human beings and destroying foreign countries for an unjust cause. And he adds, my personal participation in this war is my shame and tragedy.
I felt at that time that the prison conditions had changed, that among us, at least among fellow prisoners, they would know there was no pressure, there were no threats. I think all of us agreed, by anybody's definition of torture, it had ended in '69. The harsh prison treatment had let up tremendously, and at that time I felt I could speak out knowing that I was doing it of my own conscience and knowing that it wasn't because of the conditions in camp, and I chose to speak out. I thought I had a responsibility and obligation that if I really felt that strongly that the war was wrong, that I had an obligation to speak out. And if it was to cause me problems in the future, so be it.
If an individual came up with the approach, for example, I can't win, or it's useless to bang my head against the wall, or it's not worth it, if those attitudes then were prevalent, if they were successful in embedding those attitudes within the minds of the individuals, then later on that individual was susceptible to making propaganda tapes, to discouraging others to resist properly. They would be the ones who would meet the delegations, present the proper approach, write the proper letters. In other words, they were helping the North Vietnamese to pursue that psychological warfare that became so all important in the conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam and the United States.
Late 1970, Hanoi only now gives the total number and names of the prisoners. Coinciding with serious peace negotiations, the prisoners are filmed receiving mail from home. Hanoi allows American visitors to meet some prisoners in a move to counter U.S. charges of mistreatment. More prisoners make statements and tape recordings critical of the war. One estimate says 80% of them make some kind of statement. Later, almost all of these say they acted under duress. On Christmas Day 1970, Hanoi permits the first filmed interview by a Western reporter with two captured officers.
I have flown about 20 missions over North Vietnam when I was shot down.
I flew 11 missions in North Vietnam.
The answer, of course, is that the war must be ended, and it must be stopped now. We've just got to stop this thing.
We've had to really go to the very core of our feelings on a number of things. Loyalty, what is it? Where does it lie?
Recognizing the harsh treatment, recognizing the fact that he may very well fail and not be able to sustain himself in that very difficult and torturous situations. The individual then, who recognized the necessity to try and try again, he was the individual who really is the real hero.
I thought my duty was to my country, and my country to me means the American people. And I felt my obligation to them was more important to any titular head or any particular personality.
Christmas, 2 years later, 1972. Some of the American prisoners are filmed attending Mass at Hanoi's Catholic Cathedral. The peace negotiations have broken down. The prisoners are eyewitnesses to the first direct bombing of the capital.
While we were there, we could actually hear, and in some cases I saw a B-52 falling from the sky. We could actually see streaks of the missiles being fired at times. The bombs in some cases came very close, and I would say the attitude of most was very jubilant, very happy that it was happening, recognizing that this in fact would be the means by which the North Vietnamese would be brought to a position of compromising, and therefore our release was imminent.
The bombing lasts 11 days and nights. 15 B-52s are shot down by Soviet-supplied SAM missiles. In 8 years, nearly 1,000 U.S. airmen have died in crashes over the north. In the last days, 33 airmen are taken prisoner, bringing the number held to 566. Although peace is imminent, several of the new prisoners make anti-war statements. 5 pilots are gathered for a press conference in Hanoi.
We were only told that all our targets are military targets, and that these would be the only targets that would be hit. On that assumption, is the reason that we did do the missions, for military targets only.
I would like to say that not only have innocent civilians been killed in these bombings, but some of the bombing has been very close to prisoner of war camps and has also exposed prisoners of war to the threat of death. And that it is my opinion that continued bombing of this sort will only stiffen the determination of the Vietnamese people to continue their fight.
We have great sorrow, and we hope and pray that negotiations and Congress will see to it that the war was ended soon.
Peace negotiations resume, and the prisoners wait. Around Hanoi, civilians gather up the wreckage of the last American planes to do battle over North Vietnam. The prisoners finally receive the word. Peace is signed. In 1 month, they'll be home. Some can hardly believe it.
I was actually a little amazed, maybe even startled, I'm not sure how, because after President Nixon was overwhelmingly reelected in 1972, I figured he would think that was a mandate to do anything he wanted. And so I immediately psyched myself up for another 4 years as a prisoner of war. And when the news came out in January of 73 that they were going to sign a peace treaty, I was really shocked because I'd already decided it's going to be another 4 years, make up your mind now, and exercise and keep yourself healthy mentally and physically.
January 27th, 1973. The signing of the Paris Peace Treaty marks the end of U.S. military activity in Vietnam, and it brings the release of all American prisoners of war. In the North, these total 566. 55 died in the North during 8 years of captivity. Three weeks after the peace signing, the prisoners emerged from the Hanoi Hilton. Crowds of Vietnamese watched this symbolic finale of America's military involvement. The journey to the airport takes the pilots to the bombed capital. They will soon be home from the war, but always a part of its controversy. The American prisoners begin their homecoming divided among themselves. As they leave Hanoi, U.S. military authorities are preparing charges of misconduct against some of them. At the airport, their names are called out for the last time by Vietnamese officials. On arrival home, some prisoners petition for disciplinary action against others. Eventually, all charges are dropped. Many will face severe readjustment problems. But the returning prisoners are found to be in fairly good health. The official explanation: they are better educated and more mature than their counterparts in previous wars. The prisoners were a unique factor. Toward the end, it seemed as though America was fighting the war to free the prisoners. This gave Hanoi a negotiating advantage. Unlike other wars, there are no annual reunions. Captain Macy with a prison trophy. He becomes a colonel. Colonel Miller salutes as he steps onto U.S. soil. He later enters law and politics. At the Hanoi Hilton, after the last Americans have left, their prison clothing and bedding is collected and burned. In 1973, 1,000 American servicemen are still listed as missing in action throughout Southeast Asia. By 1980, that figure has been reduced to 22.